Thanks, Caroline. Thank you so much for that. That was an amazing introduction. I don't know if that's me that you just talked about, but all that activity, it did sound like I'm involved with that. And thank you, Karina, for hosting and inviting me to be a part of this. Daniel Hartman, Dr. Chow, who is a friend and mentor, thank you so much for creating this space for all of us to be here to learn from one another. I think if you feel the way that I do, I feel like most of the times I get it wrong, and then half the time I'm just constantly learning. And so all of the time, it really is a learning journey, and glad to contribute to the conversation, especially as we think about what's happening in the United States. And I'm going to blow that up just a little bit to North America because some of my story does overlap with Canada in terms of my missionary experience. But then I also want to recognize my colleagues on the call here because the future Dr. Stephanie Noble, it's hard to follow her. I know she did an amazing job talking about a very beautiful part of our city in West Chicago. And so, Stephanie, thank you for doing that. And I really want to do kind of build on some of that and kind of blow up the picture a little bit to the U.S. context. I'm going to share a bunch of slides, and we may get through them all or not. That's okay, and I can hand them off to your team if you all want to look at more of the slides. But I want to kind of set the scene for really where we're at in the United States and both North America, U.S. and Canada, in particular in terms of like the need for more churches. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of shrink that down to my experience as a missionary church planter and my experience planting churches in the U.S., but specifically in how to engage neighborhoods and bringing the peace of God to neighborhoods. And that was a imperfect endeavor for me. It was when we planted churches in Toronto. It is right now in our experience right now planting these networks of missional communities. And then I also want to end our time by sharing a story of a friend of mine named Carl Johnson and Melanie Johnson in St. Paul. And they're planting a church that I think is a beautiful model of actually bringing the peace of God into a neighborhood and really focus on not just planting worship services, but really beautifying the neighborhood through, really tangible engagement. And that really is where I think we're at as a continent, but specifically North America, U.S., and Canada. In terms of church planting, some of you may or may not be familiar with the idea of church planting, but it's pretty simple. It's starting new churches, but not just starting new churches, starting churches that are appropriate for the context of the people in a particular community. And then also starting churches that really have engagement and both social engagement and spiritual engagement in mind. And I think that's so crucial for where we're at in North America, because by and large, over the last 40 years, the kind of church planting that was the predominant version of church planting tended to center around starting worshiping congregations or starting worshiping services. Obviously, it's much more complex than just trying to start a Sunday worship service, but there was a prevailing model, and I would still say it's probably, my best guesstimate is about maybe 70% of our church planting models in U.S. and Canada still is that prevailing model of starting a Sunday worship gathering and then beginning auxiliary ministries from that gathering. And by no means am I saying that that is not a God honoring thing. But we are realizing that over the last 40 years of this prevailing model, that it has diminishing returns. But on top of that, the premise of that particular model depended a lot on demographics that are just no longer the reality here in the U.S. And so sometimes people have called this the church growth model, but it's more specific than just church growth. It has a lot to do with the idea that if we can create a worship gathering that has lower cultural barriers, then more people would be willing to be a part of that. And that may have been true for certain instances and certain implementations of that model. But the vast majority of organizations that I now work with at the Send Institute, I wear multiple hats, and you can kind of tell that Caroline mentioned a few of those hats. But my primary work at the Send Institute, we're seeing that this particular style of church planting, starting worship gatherings on a Sunday, um, is less and less effective when it was first really imagined in the 80s and 90s. And so, according to my best guesstimates, and I have slides, and these are completely different presentations, but I just want to set the foundation. The rate in which our population is growing, the racial ethnic complexity. You all may know that according to the U.S. Census, by 2040, 2045-ish or so, the U.S. will, for the first time, be a no majority context, meaning whites will be less than 50% of the population for the first time. Think about that. We're closer to that reality in 2040, 2045, where there are less than 50% whites, than we are to when Rick Warren started Saddleback Church. And I don't know if you know Rick Warren, but he would be considered a pioneer in the church 40 years ago, which he started Saddleback in the early 80s. So we're much more closer to the reality of the 2040, 2045 census than we are to when church models, church planting models were developed. And this is why I think it's an important conversation. The complexity of our neighborhoods, the complexity of our cities, the complexity of our towns, the complexity and the nuances of not just racial ethnic categories, but then the multi-layer of second, third generation peoples like that all is changing the landscape. As we think about the growth of the Hispanic or Latino American community, that is like really, it's the landscape in which we call North America is changing rapidly. And therefore, our response to that needs to be appropriate. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is how to appropriately think about engaging neighborhoods, especially if you're not a son or a daughter of that neighborhood. I'm a strong advocate for planting in communities that you are familiar with, that that you grew up in. But the reality also is that God continues to use people to cross cultural boundaries, even if it's the other side of the railroad tracks, to start new congregations and to accomplish some of the things that you all are trying to do here in Mosaic, which is to bring reconciliation. It's funny. I work with church planters every single day. And you never hear an Anglo or an African American church planter say that they're not planting a multi-ethnic church. It's embedded now into the idea that when we start a church, we want to start a church that's multi-ethnic. It's almost assumed. There's a red flag when a white person says, "I want to start a church for white people." But this is the day and age. This is where we're at today, and it's important for us to think about what are the appropriate ways to enter into a neighborhood. And my guess is that the future Dr. Stephanie Noble, she talked a lot about the dynamics of Western Chicago, and how entering into a context like that, there's a lot of legacy that needs to be honored and recognized in the work there that God is already doing. And so some of those things will be things that we'll kind of dive into. I'm going to give some story, I'm going to give some principles, and I'm going to end with the story, if that's okay. So I'm going to now go to share screen here. Can you all see this okay? Is it just the actual screen, or do you see my
I
whole?
see it. We see it.
Okay, great. And it's not the whole entire presentation, it's just a screen, correct?
Well, I see how church plants are bringing peace to their neighborhoods.
Uh-huh. But you don't,
Yes.
okay, that's all. Okay, great. All right, thank you. I'm doing the share portion of the screen, so I'm not quite sure how much you see or you don't see. So that's perfect. Thank you, Karina. And I also want to talk about my own story. So I'm going to frame this in terms of a tale of two cities. And this is my family here. Caroline mentioned my wife, Linda. And Caroline, so I am writing a book. I'm actually writing it with Matthew Sorens, who are good friends of Linda and mine. And it's called Inalienable. It's InterVarsity. We just finally put in our first draft. Lord willing, it'll come out this fall. I had to put my comps on hold, Stephanie and Dr. Cha, but we got that book out, so now I can go back to my comps. But this is my family, and we spent the last previous 5 years before we moved to Chicago in downtown Toronto. You may not be familiar with Toronto. It's Americans tend to think Canada is the 51st state, but obviously it's its own country. And Toronto is its largest city. It's very diverse. 52% of those who are in Toronto were born outside of Canada. just a huge gateway for immigrant communities. As a matter of fact, Doug Saunders, who's a journalist, wrote a book called The Arrival City. It's a watershed book, and for us to understand, what gateway cities are like all around the world. Toronto being one of them. And then obviously we're now here in Chicago. But just to give you an idea of the different two contexts in which my family came from doing missionary work and church planting, which was Toronto, Canada, and then Chicago. You might be surprised that although Chicago is still much larger in terms of the metropolitan, it's 9.4 million. When you look at the city proper, Chicago's been somewhat on a steady decline over the last few years, whereas Toronto has actually been on the incline. So back in 2014, Toronto actually surpassed Chicago as the fourth largest city in North America. The first being Mexico City, obviously the second being New York City, LA, and then now Toronto. And then in terms of neighborhoods, you can see the complexity of Toronto. You see that there are 140 official neighborhoods in Toronto, in Chicago having 77 recognized communities. And so I just want you to see the complexity of the context of ministry that many of us are in right now as we live here in Chicago and its surrounding suburbs. Compare that to also the complexity of ministry that my family had come from coming into Chicago here. And I want to share a little bit of the story of our planting journey, just to kind of give you an illustration for what it means to enter into a community, so that you would see the peace of Jesus come onto them. We planted in a neighborhood called Regent Park, Toronto. It's a beautiful neighborhood, beautiful people, a rich legacy of diversity, but also one of the most highly serviced neighborhood in Toronto, because it was an experimental community back in the 40s and 50s, and that a lot of experimental communities happened. In the United States, a lot of our current urban landscape was set during the same time. They were doing the same thing in Canada. And Regent Park was kind of this experiment to really provide a mixture of social housing and then also regular public housing. And that very similar story to here in the United States. But over time, the neighborhood itself, it ended up being more poor than it did anything else. And over decades and decades of the city trying to figure out how to revitalize and to really help improve the social conditions of Regent Park. It's one of the most highly serviced areas. It's 4 square blocks, very densely populated. And as I'm just going through some of these pictures, this is what it looked like early on when they were introducing high rises and some of the project housing, and how it continued to grow. And then the complexities of the fast, rate of growth among immigrants, and primarily in Regent Park, they were Hindu and Muslim immigrants in the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And so it's a beautiful neighborhood, and I miss it terribly. And it's unlike anything in the United States. I mean, I have not yet entered a neighborhood or a city that is quite as diverse and eclectic as this part of Toronto. And we did our very best, as in the early 2000s, or 2010s, the city was working really hard to bring levels of social change. Gentrification they just embraced that, and they had to really come in and reinvent the neighborhood. And you can imagine all of the hurts and the pains that have come with that. And in our attempt to really just embed ourselves, it was a long entry point into this neighborhood. And it was one that we were mentored and coached right away by some of the neighborhood leaders to come around and underscore the beautiful work that had already been done, rather than think that we can actually create something new. And case in point, one of the early lessons that we learned there, that skinny guy that has a weird smile, that's not Francis Chan, that is me. I was in the midst of a long fast. I lost a lot of weight. Man, I look scary actually in that photo. But these are some of the youth in the neighborhood that were just a part of our life, and learning to be mentors with many of them Hindu and Muslim. And, more than anything that we had to teach them, we had so much to learn from them. And one of those instances were early on when we were having really what we were calling vision nights. We were just trying to understand better the neighborhood. And so we invited some of the neighborhood people into a space where we can learn some of their stories and share our own. And I want to recount an episode that happened that night. I had just casted what I thought was a compelling vision to start a new church in that neighborhood. And then a Canadian man asked me, "Are you American?" And I said, "Yes." "How long have you lived in this neighborhood?" I said, 3 months. And then he said, "Don't bring that American religious and the four-letter word here." To which my response was, "Okay." um, and that was a necessary lesson. It was a necessary encounter, interaction. It immediately put us in a different posture. Regardless of my intentions and my motivation, I realize that there is a perception that when you're an outsider coming into a neighborhood that's especially experiencing fast change, that there is a sense in which you're bringing some kind of canned message or some kind of foreign culture into that environment. And even though it was just Canada, even the idea of American religion is a huge, huge obstacle for a lot of people. And so the church that ended up being Trinity Life Church, and Mike and Missy are now leading that church. They're on the right in that picture. That's my wife Lynn and I on the left. It's a drastically integrated approach to being embedded in the neighborhood. As a matter of fact, we don't own a building. They don't own a building. They still rent a high school, but they rent a community. They are leasing a facility. And they call it the New Commons, because what they imagine that space to be is a space between the church and then also the community. And so they host everything from like youth groups there, and not Christian youth groups. Like a lot of them are Muslim youth groups, but it's a place for others to come into where people can interact and share their lives. That's why they call it the New Common Space. Fully supported, fully funded by the church. No worship gatherings happen there, but it's another way to seek the peace of a neighborhood and to honor the legacy and the history that's already there. Fast forward to Caroline did mention the Prodigal Network, which is a network. I love your description of it, of Caroline is perfect. I feel like you should be writing the marketing material for the Prodigal Network. But last year, in the midst of the pandemic, towards the end of the summer, a group of us began imagining what would church look like if it was more decentralized. Although we enjoy the worship gathering, we enjoy the Sunday gathering, which is still a part of our ethos. We began imagining, what if church was more like a movement and more of like a decentralized network of missionary communities. And so we're in the midst of pioneering some of that. And even last week was fun because our church was not able to gather in person, and neither were we looking to gather in person in a building at least, but we gathered in two different locations, and we were just trying to be a part of the neighborhood. We were with one another celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, but we were also inviting neighbors into our space and into our time. And a part of and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but a part of our reimagining right now is to develop an idea of what would church like if it was a movement, rather than just a gathering. And so we're really spending some time to really reimagine, what does it mean to be a church, a community of activists, a community of missionaries, a community of missional leaders, and developing some of our discipleship pathways towards that. So that really is where our personal ministry is at right now, just to catch you up to speed. But I share all these things. I think it's really important as we think about like church planting as a missionary endeavor. From the book Tradecraft, I really think this is a very powerful thing that we need to reconcile ourselves to. And the writers, Kreider and McCurry, they actually say this, that in missions, there's often a distinction made between missionaries, those who have been sent to deliberately cross cultural boundaries, and quote unquote nationals, and the people who are on the receiving end of the gospel ministry. We are convinced, however, that Christians on mission need to recognize that each of us is both missionary and national. That is, in Christ, we are sent ones, but we are also recipients of the good news. That every stage of our engagement requires us to reevaluate and imagine ourselves through the lens of the gospel. And so, like there is the gospel changes the missionary just as much as it's supposed to change the quote unquote national. And that tension is a very important one. And I think it's increasingly an important one as North America continues to diversify and complexify. And I want to introduce this idea that actually comes from Andrew Walls, who's just a theologian, missiologist out in the UK. Very familiar name in our program, right, Stephanie? But I want to talk about this idea of being indigenous and pilgrim. And I think the gospel of the kingdom transforms a community without erasing its history. That when the gospel really does its work, it brings cultural transformation, but it doesn't erase the history that's already there. And this is so crucial for us right now because obviously, as we continue to unpack and deconstruct, the impact of colonial missions, we can perpetuate some of these same things if we're not aware that the gospel is supposed to continually change us as missionaries, just as it is going to change those who we are engaging. And I took Andrew Waz's idea of indigenous and pilgrim, and I put it on a grid just for us to understand a little bit more of the tensions here. If indigenous means obviously that you're local, that you're part of the fabric of that particular community, and that you've been there for a while. Pilgrim means you're on a journey, you're changing. And so on this particular grid here, indigenous is this idea that your identity is primarily yours. Colonial means your identity is primarily somebody else's. Pilgrim means that you're on a journey towards, transformation. Fixed means you're not. And so what are ways in which we can think about how communities are engaged in understanding the repercussions of that? Well, if it's primarily through, expecting people to be on a pilgrimage, but then inherit an external identity, then that's going to put onto that particular community cultural suppression. If we have high expectations of that community not experiencing any change, and the gospel not transforming them, but then they're inheriting this new identity that's foreign to them, then it's a form of cultural oppression. If they are going to remain indigenous in their identity, and it's fixed, and there is no challenge from the gospel to renew, revitalize, to reimagine, to re-Jesus themselves, then they are stuck in a form of cultural idolatry. But Andrew Walls would argue this happened in the book of Ephesians, this happened in the early church, this continues to happen in context every day, that when the gospel allows us to go on a journey to experience transformation, but also to celebrate the best parts of us that God created, then we are actually experiencing cultural transformation. And I think that is, in a sense, when we're talking about seeking the peace and seeking the shalom of a neighborhood, of a specific community, that in our minds, albeit we won't do it perfectly, that we're aware of these dynamics so that we avoid cultural idolatry, cultural oppression, suppression, and we understand at best that we want to bring in cultural transformation. Here's some questions that we help church planters to kind of think through when they're entering into a community. Very basic questions that form the curriculum for a lot of training. But part of the question is, how does the gospel affirm, complete, or challenge the local narrative? I come from somewhat of a more Reformed tradition, but those of you who are very familiar with the Wesleyan traditions of prevenient grace, which I am very huge fan of that. That God's been at work, God continues to do work, even if there aren't any Christians in that particular neighborhood or area, that God is already at work there. How does our understanding of the gospel actually come in and affirm and complete, but also how does it challenge the local narratives? This is an underlying question that as a missionary coming into a neighborhood, seeking its peace, and that it's very important to ask. And then what does gospel shalom look like in this community? If we were to reimagine or imagine what gospel shalom looks like in this community, what would that look like? And it's probably not going to come from a particular worldview that an outsider has. I think it's going to come through a lot of investigation, a lot of relationship, a lot of understanding the stories. understanding what other religions on the ground actually think about what does living in a pluralistic neighborhood, what does that look like? And so this is a huge task for church planters and missionaries to be good listeners. The Prodigal Network, the church that we're a part of right now, even though we're decentralized into missional communities, we try to get together once a month, or there's a cadence in which we try to get together, and we meet in an area in Oakbrook Terrace. In a neighborhood called Brandywine. It's so diverse. It's actually next to one of the largest mosques in Chicagoland. And I've been trying to build a relationship with the mosque there, and it's an engagement that we've been trying to create. And we have a couple that actually lives in Brandywine, and they are very engaged with their some of their Hindu neighbors. But part of this is also just asking, what does it look like for us to live in peace together as a pluralistic community? And these are very important questions. It's not one dimensional. You can't give the answers. It's something that you pose to a table, and you begin to figure out what some of those things are together. And then what are the appropriate places or ways to gather? I'm just going to kind of speed through this here. And then who should develop discipleship pathways in environments, not always assuming that even as the missionary and the church planter that you're going to have the best strategies for how to develop that. And then lastly is, how do we do effective outreach? And this is an important question to help church planters or those who are engaging as a missionary into a neighborhood, is what is effective, what does appropriate outreach look like? Instead of actually giving you like a bunch of examples, I want to do is I want to provide a grid. I'm a huge fan of grids. And to kind of think about what are ways in which missionaries or church planters, as they enter to a neighborhood, how do they need to think when they think about appropriate engagement? And I want us to think about exposure, which is the level of awareness the community has about a church plant, and then engagement, the depth of relationships a church planting team has with community members. Again, I'll put this on a grid, and as we look at this first quadrant, we're looking at what does it look like to have appropriate engagement that sometimes is actually low exposure and then low engagement. And what I mean by that is that this quadrant is activities where the community has low awareness about your church and your team has low interaction with the community. And you may be thinking, that doesn't sound effective. That just sounds like you're just hanging around. And actually, there are occasions where that's helpful. Some examples are anonymous acts of kindness, certain kinds of individual volunteering, basic prayer walking, very low exposure, very low engagement, but none of us would argue that prayer walking is not important. Advantages of this would be easier to mobilize team members to participate. It's a posture observing and learning, and there's low commitment. Obviously, there are disadvantages to just doing these things. The community doesn't know much about the church, and then the team does not get to know much about the community. And then there's really low commitment. If you don't have any exposure or any engagement, there really is no commitment to that particular community. If we think about what it looks like to actually have high engagement but still low exposure, that would mean that activities where the community has low awareness about your church, but your team is very engaged in the community. Some examples of that might be hosting dinners for neighbors, serving on a community board, which in Toronto we did a lot of that. I sat on multiple boards in our neighborhood, and there's certain kinds of mercy projects. And so you're very involved, but then there is no expectation for people to enter into your church or religious space. And the advantages of that is there's a no strings attached and no bait and switch. There's quality relationships that form with non-believers, and then deep ministry can happen outside of the church or outside of the worship gathering. Obviously, some of the disadvantages of this is that activities can often feel disconnected from the church, and then it can lead to a bifurcation of serving the community and then growing the church, which is all sometimes can actually create a tension where we're very involved out there, but we're not paying attention to the life of the church. If we go to the third quadrant, which would be high exposure but low engagement, I think you're kind of getting the rhythm of what I'm talking about now, right? Activities with a high awareness about your church but low interaction with the community. Some examples of this would be posting flyers, canvassing. This is not a thing as much anymore, but some church plants still do that. Sponsoring some event in the name of the church, certain kinds of large gathering events, high exposure, but you may not be deeply engaging. The advantages of this is that there is somewhat of an air war strategy for communicating who you are as a church to the community. There are less people that you have to train or manage, and then there's the awareness of the church that's being raised in the community. There's obviously a lot of disadvantages of this approach, in them being people know of the church, but they do not get to know the people in the church. And the less people are actually involved in ministry, because it becomes more about almost like a marketing strategy. And the last one would be, high exposure, high engagement. And the idea here obviously would be to hear some examples of hosting a community block party, going door to door to pray and share about the church, adopting a school, very effective way to embed yourself. And then interaction, the advantages are there's a lot of interaction with a lot of people in very meaningful ways. The community sees the church in tangible ways. Church planting team members feel very involved. They're not just serving on a Sunday, team, but they're very involved in the community itself. The disadvantages of this is it requires tremendous planning and energy, and then sometimes people can become potentially addicted to the adrenaline of this kind of ministry. And so I share these things because there are appropriate ways, given the context in the community, that a church planter or missionary should enter into a context respecting what's already happening there. And there are various combinations in which in some seasons you may need to do more high exposure, low engagement, depending on your giftings, depending on the stories and the assets that God has given your community. You may be able to do more, high exposure, high engagement type things. But it really becomes a part of asking the question, how do we underscore what is already happening in the community? How do we actually serve alongside and not, compete against? And then how do we continuously be on a learning journey where we're being changed by the gospel as missionaries just as much as the people that we want to reach are being changed by the gospel as well. I'm going to end our time by sharing a quick video of someone who I think has been able to do this beautifully. The Johnsons, this is Melanie and Carl Johnson. They are planting a church called Faith City Church in Dayton's Bluff neighborhood in St. Paul, Minneapolis, which is a very diverse. It's very it's actually almost like half African American, half Asian American. And part of their church planting journey has been to figure out that we can't just start a Sunday gathering. What are the deepest needs of this community? And they discovered that it was food insecurity. So as a part of their church, they not only launched a church, but they launched a grocery store called Storehouse Grocers. And I want to just give Caro a couple of minutes here. It's via video. Just a chance to share the story of Storehouse Grocers. So I'm going to launch the video. I hope you all can hear it. I've had some issues with sound before. If it doesn't work, then I think Daniel Hartman's going to show the video. But if you can give me a thumbs up to make sure that you can hear the video, that'd be awesome.
It's not just a grocery store. It's a part of the neighborhood, and we just want to be woven into the fabric of people's lives. Faith City Church's mission is changing destinies by ending everyday hunger, and the direct result that came out of that was to start a grocery store. We first wanted to start a grocery store that had 300 basic need items for families so that they can actually be able to afford to have dinner at home every single night. We knew that there were 66,000 people in St. Paul that were food insecure. That means 3 out of 5 days in a week they couldn't put food on the table. And so we said, first, food is really high, and then access to food was really difficult. And so people have to take a couple of buses, a lift, bump some rides just to get groceries. And so we said we wanted to be a fair bargain grocery solution to everyone in Dayton's Bluff. They're actually shocked at how much food costs when they see the end of the bill. They're like, that's it? Some people have felt really bad about how much the food costs, and I tell them this is how much it should cost you to buy groceries. Food deserts are created because resources have been taken out of certain neighborhoods. America had no food deserts in the 80s. And so food deserts started becoming a historical thing that was created in neighborhoods and cities. There's food insecurity, and then there's like food deserts, and they don't correlate together. Right now, Dayton's Bluff would not be considered a food desert, but we still have food insecurity. So we have 2 or 3 grocery stores. We have some ethnic grocery stores, and we have a co-op, and now we have Storehouse. But that doesn't mean that people can afford to shop at these places, and people can afford to have these places. So geographically, to have a place where people can afford to shop, we had a Cub Foods, they shut down after being here for 15 years. And so food deserts are created because people have not poured resource back into these neighborhoods. What people should know is I'm truly invested, not in the buildings, not in the organization, but in people. And so I'm truly invested in seeing everyone who is hungry, everyone who has an issue, have a problem. I'm interested in seeing things change and seeing things transform in our neighborhood. And I believe that there's people here that I still haven't met that believe in that same kind of mission in their life. They love Dayton's Bluff and they want to see it transform. Some places that are really welcoming, and Dayton's Bluff just has a beauty about it that a lot of people who don't live here or don't come here don't understand.
You've come up with, you've got 3 in-person screenings by drive-in, right? So,
well, I wanted to end on Carl and Melanie's story there, just to give you a taste of what some church plants are doing in the United States. And they're not just starting religious services, but they're meeting real, tangible needs. And he is committed to the gospel. He's committed to seeing a church emerge in Dayton's Bluff. But he's also committing to, participating in the holistic healing of that neighborhood. And they found their niche. Their niche is to provide affordable groceries through Storehouse Grocers. And so I hope that this gives you a little bit of imagination for what kinds of ministries God may be calling you all to. And I'd love to process more with you on the back end of your breakout. So, Caroline, I'll throw it back to you.